Trauma didn't break you. It sharpened you in ways most people will never understand. And once you see this, you can't unsee it. Most people grow up believing trauma is a life sentence, a label, a limitation, a permanent scar. They're told that if something painful happened, then something inside them must be damaged forever. That belief is not only wrong, it's dangerous, because it keeps people stuck in survival mode, mistaking adaptation for identity and pain for destiny. Here's the truth most never hear. Trauma doesn't define who you are. It reveals what was forced to evolve. Carl Jung understood this deeply. He saw that suffering, when faced consciously, doesn't shrink the soul, it expands it. What feels like damage is often refinement happening under pressure. If you've ever felt different after pain, more sensitive, more aware, more tired of superficial answers, this isn't weakness. It's the nervous system learning depth. The problem is, no one teaches you how to use what trauma refined. Without guidance, it turns into anxiety, self-doubt, or isolation. With understanding, it becomes clarity, strength, and direction. In this video, you'll discover why what hurt you didn't ruin you. It prepared you. And how integrating that truth can change the way you see yourself, your past, and the power you've been carrying without realizing it. Trauma doesn't knock politely. It crashes in, flips the furniture of the soul, and leaves a mess no one taught you how to clean. But here's the uncomfortable truth most people avoid. Fire doesn't only destroy, it forges. In psychology, healing, and deep self-awareness, pain often acts like heat applied to raw metal. Without it, there's no shape, no edge, no strength. Many people spend years asking, why did this happen to me? The wiser question is, what did this awaken in me? Because trauma, when faced consciously, has a strange way of sharpening perception, resilience, and emotional depth. Think about how diamonds are formed. Not in comfort, not in safety. They're born under pressure so intense it would crush anything fragile. Human resilience works much the same way. Trauma pushes the nervous system into survival mode, forcing rapid adaptation. Some people numb themselves, others grow painfully aware. That awareness, though exhausting, becomes the seed of transformation. Carl Jung observed that suffering often expands consciousness, not because it's pleasant, but because it strips illusions away. After trauma, many people say, I can't go back to who I was. And that's exactly the point. Growth rarely looks like restoration. In everyday life, this shows up subtly. Someone who's endured emotional pain often reads rooms better, senses shifts in tone, and notices what others miss. That's not paranoia, it's refined perception. Trauma trains attention the way darkness sharpens night vision. Of course, unchecked, it can turn into anxiety, but guided properly, it becomes intuition. Practices like journaling, therapy, or reflective reading, books like Man's Search for Meaning or Jung's own essays, help convert raw pain into meaning. The difference between being haunted and being refined is integration. There's also a reason people who've suffered deeply tend to ask bigger questions about life, purpose, and identity. Trauma interrupts autopilot living. It forces confrontation with mortality, loss, and uncertainty. That confrontation hurts, but it also matures. Like fire removing impurities from gold, suffering burns away superficial goals and replaces them with values. Suddenly, status matters less. Truth matters more. That's why many resilient individuals feel out of sync with shallow conversations. They didn't become difficult. They became deeper. Still, refinement isn't automatic. Fire can harden clay or melt steel. The difference lies in response. Avoidance keeps trauma raw. Conscious engagement transforms it. That's why Jung emphasized awareness over suppression. When pain is observed rather than escaped, it reshapes identity instead of defining it. And once someone realizes trauma didn't ruin them, it trained them. A new curiosity emerges. If this pain refined me, What else has been shaping me quietly all along? That question naturally pulls the mind toward the next layer of understanding. Trauma rarely explains itself. It doesn't sit you down and say, "Here's the lesson." Instead, it teaches in patterns, reactions, and emotional echoes. It shows up in the way the body tenses before the mind understands why or how certain situations trigger disproportionate responses. This is why trauma feels confusing. It communicates indirectly. Carl Jung believed that what remains unconscious returns as fate. In other words, unexamined pain doesn't disappear, it quietly runs the show. Awareness turns chaos into instruction. Think of trauma like a strict teacher who never raises their voice. The lessons repeat until they're learned. The same relationship dynamics, the same fears, the same self-sabotage loops. People often say, "Why does this keep happening to me?" When the deeper question is, what hasn't been understood yet? Trauma refines through repetition. Each emotional trigger is feedback, not punishment. Once someone recognizes this, emotional intelligence increases rapidly. Patterns stop feeling random and start feeling readable. In daily life, this might look like overreacting to criticism or feeling abandoned when nothing objectively happened. Instead of self-judgment, the mentor's approach is curiosity. What memory does this emotion resemble? What old survival strategy is being reused? Practical tools help here. Breath work to calm the nervous system, writing down emotional reactions in real time, or even voice noting feelings to track recurring themes. Over time, the silent teacher becomes audible. Jung often emphasized that pain carries meaning, but meaning is never obvious at first glance. Trauma teaches boundaries, discernment, and self-respect, though in harsh ways. Someone who was once overly trusting may develop stronger intuition. Someone who endured neglect often learns self-reliance. These aren't flaws, they're adaptations. The mistake is treating adaptations as permanent identities rather than transitional tools. Awareness allows choice to replace reflex. Once trauma is seen as a teacher rather than a curse, resistance softens. Lessons no longer feel personal attacks, but invitations to mature. That shift changes everything. How relationships are chosen, how fear is handled, how inner dialogue sounds. And with that realization comes a deeper curiosity. If trauma has been teaching all along, what other hidden parts of the psyche have been shaping decisions from behind the scenes? That question opens the door to the next topic. One of the most subtle traps trauma creates is identity fusion. When something painful happens, the mind quietly starts using it as a name tag. The abandoned one, the broken one, the betrayed one. Over time, the event stops being something that happened and becomes something someone believes they are. Carl Jung warned against this collapse of identity because consciousness cannot grow when it's trapped inside a single story. Events shape us, yes, but they are not the self. Think of life like a book rather than a headline. A headline grabs attention, but it never tells the whole story. Trauma is a bold headline, shocking, emotional, unforgettable. But the self is written across hundreds of pages, most of them quiet. When people define themselves by a single chapter, they unconsciously freeze growth. Healing begins when someone can say, "This chapter mattered, but it's not the author of my life." That shift alone loosens trauma's grip. In everyday behavior, identity fusion shows up as rigid self-talk. "I'm bad at relationships. I can't trust anyone. This is just how I am." These statements feel factual, but they're often trauma speaking in the voice of certainty. A practical exercise is to add one phrase to these thoughts. Because of what happened, notice how it creates distance. It separates experience from essence. That space is where self-awareness and choice return. Jung believed the ego often clings to suffering because it provides structure. Pain, oddly enough, can feel safer than the unknown. Letting go of a trauma-based identity can feel like stepping into fog. Who am I without this story? That fear is natural and temporary. Growth always destabilizes before it clarifies. Like shedding an old skin, it feels vulnerable before it feels freeing. When someone realizes they are more than what happened, curiosity replaces self-blame. New questions emerge. What parts of me existed before this pain? What parts survived it? What parts were born because of it? These questions don't erase the past, they reorganize it. And that reorganization naturally leads to a deeper confrontation with something Jung spoke about often, the hidden parts of the self that trauma brings into the light. Pain, when avoided, hardens into bitterness. Pain, when faced, transforms. Carl Jung often compared psychological growth to alchemy, the ancient art of turning base metal into gold. Trauma is the raw material, unpleasant, heavy, and difficult to handle. Most people try to throw it away, but alchemy never begins with comfort. It begins with what feels impure. The moment someone stops asking how to get rid of pain and starts asking how to work with it, transformation quietly begins. Imagine pain like smoke filling a room. If you panic and run, you never learn where the fire is. But if you pause, breathe, and look carefully, the source becomes visible. Emotional pain works the same way. Anxiety, anger, and numbness aren't enemies. They're signals. Jung believed symptoms are messages from the psyche, not malfunctions. When someone listens instead of suppressing, suffering starts to reorganize itself into insight. In practical terms, this is where conscious reflection matters. Simple habits, like sitting with discomfort for 2 minutes instead of escaping into distraction, build emotional resilience. Writing one honest page a day about what hurts, without censoring, does more than positive thinking ever could. Reading reflective works, such as Jung's Modern Man in Search of a Soul, helps people realize they're not alone in this inner struggle. Pain becomes less personal and more archetypal. Alchemy doesn't rush. Heat must be applied gradually. Too much, too fast, and the material cracks. This is why healing can't be forced. Some days progress looks like insight, other days it looks like rest. The mistake many make is believing refinement should feel inspiring. Often it feels quiet, uncomfortable, and slow. But beneath the surface, the psyche is reorganizing, turning raw emotion into wisdom. Once someone experiences pain as something that can be transformed rather than endured, a subtle power emerges. Fear loses its authority. Emotions become information. And with that shift comes a deeper realization. If pain can be integrated, then perhaps the darkest parts of the self hold something valuable too. Something Jung called the shadow. Most people are taught to fear their darker sides. Anger, envy, shame, resentment. These emotions are labeled as flaws to be eliminated. Carl Jung saw this as a dangerous misunderstanding. He called these rejected parts of the psyche the shadow, not because they are evil, but because they remain unseen. Trauma often forces the shadow into visibility. In moments of pain, reactions emerge that surprise us. The goal isn't to erase them, but to understand what they protect. Imagine the shadow like a locked basement. Everything shoved down there still exists. It just gathers pressure. Trauma acts like a broken door, releasing what was hidden. When someone snaps, withdraws, or self-sabotages, it's rarely because they are weak. It's because an ignored part is demanding acknowledgement. Jung believed that what we deny gains power. What we observe loses its grip. In daily life, shadow work begins with honesty. Not brutal self-judgment, but quiet recognition. When irritation appears, instead of saying, "I shouldn't feel this," a wiser response is, "What boundary was crossed?" When jealousy shows up, it might point toward a suppressed desire. Practical steps help. noting emotional spikes, reflecting before reacting, and asking what need is being expressed beneath the surface. These small pauses build self-awareness quickly. Trauma intensifies the shadow because survival demands efficiency. The psyche adopts shortcuts. Hypervigilance, control, emotional distance. These aren't character flaws, they're adaptive strategies. The danger comes when they outlive their usefulness. Jung emphasized integration, allowing the shadow to exist consciously without letting it dominate behavior. Integrated shadow becomes strength, assertiveness instead of aggression, discernment instead of suspicion. Once the shadow is no longer treated as an enemy, internal conflict decreases. Energy once spent on suppression becomes available for creativity, clarity, and connection. And with that integration, something interesting happens. The individual starts noticing how trauma didn't just reveal darkness, it sharpened perception, sensitivity, and emotional depth. That realization naturally leads into the next layer of refinement. Some people move through life skating on the surface. Others are pulled under early and forced to learn how to breathe in deeper waters. Trauma does that. It interrupts comfort and demands attention. While others chase noise and distraction, the traumatized mind learns to listen inward. Carl Jung suggested that depth is often born from necessity, not preference. When illusions fall away, questions get heavier, quieter, and more honest. Depth isn't about intelligence or education, it's about exposure. When someone has sat with loss, fear, or uncertainty long enough, small talk loses its shine. Priorities shift. Truth matters more than approval. Meaning matters more than speed. This is why people shaped by trauma often feel out of sync with fast, shallow environments. It's not arrogance, it's recalibration. The nervous system has learned what's fragile and what's real. In practical terms, this depth shows up as reflection. These individuals pause before reacting. They read between the lines. They notice emotional undercurrents others miss. That sensitivity can feel like a burden until it's understood as an instrument. Journaling, contemplative walks, or reading reflective thinkers, Jung, Viktor Frankl, even philosophy light works like the alchemist, help translate depth into clarity rather than isolation. There's also a quiet loneliness that comes with depth. When someone sees beyond appearances, it can be hard to find mirrors. Jung warned that individuation, becoming oneself, often separates before it connects. This isn't a flaw in the process, it's part of it. Depth matures compassion. It teaches patience. It sharpens discernment about where to invest emotional energy. Once depth is recognized as a refinement rather than a defect, self-trust grows. The question shifts from "why am I like this?" to "how do I use this well?" And that naturally opens the door to another realization. Trauma didn't just deepen thought. It reshaped emotional sensitivity in powerful, unexpected ways. Sensitivity is often misunderstood as fragility, but trauma tells a different story. When survival is at stake, the nervous system sharpens perception, tone of voice, facial expressions, subtle shifts in mood. Everything starts to matter. Carl Jung understood that heightened sensitivity is not weakness. It's a refined survival mechanism. What once helped someone stay safe doesn't simply disappear when danger ends. It evolves, waiting to be understood and directed. Think of sensitivity like a finely tuned antenna. It picks up signals others walk past without noticing. Trauma trains this antenna through repetition. The mind learns to scan environments quickly, not out of fear, but out of necessity. The problem isn't sensitivity itself, it's when it operates without conscious control. Unexamined sensitivity turns into overwhelm. Integrated sensitivity becomes emotional intelligence. In daily life, this shows up as strong empathy. People shaped by trauma often feel others' emotions deeply, sometimes before a word is spoken. This can feel exhausting until boundaries are learned. Simple practices help. limiting emotional exposure, choosing calm environments, and grounding the body through movement or breath. Even short daily walks or slow breathing routines retrain sensitivity from defense to awareness. Jung believed intuition is the unconscious speaking through sensation. Sensitivity gives intuition a voice. That's why many people refined by trauma develop strong gut feelings about people, decisions, timing. The mistake is doubting this inner signal because it doesn't sound logical. Sensitivity doesn't replace reason, it complements it. Together they create discernment. Once sensitivity is honored instead of suppressed, it becomes a guide rather than a burden. Emotional reactions slow down. Clarity increases. And with that clarity comes another realization. True healing isn't about deleting the past. It's about learning how to carry it consciously without letting it rule the present. One of the biggest myths about healing is the idea of erasing the past. People chase the fantasy of becoming someone untainted, as if pain were a stain that could be scrubbed away. Carl Jung rejected this completely. Healing, in his view, was never about deletion. It was about integration. What is denied fragments the psyche. What is acknowledged finds its place. Trauma loses its power not when it disappears, but when it's no longer in control. Think of the mind like a house. Trauma is not a fire that destroys the structure. It's a room that was locked and left unattended. Healing doesn't mean demolishing the house. It means opening the door, airing the space out, and deciding how that room fits into the whole. When memories, emotions, and reactions are integrated, they stop intruding unexpectedly. They become part of the story instead of hijacking it. In real life, integration looks subtle. It's the moment someone notices a trigger rising and chooses not to react automatically. It's being able to say, "This feeling belongs to the past, but I'm here now." Practical tools matter here. Grounding techniques, reflective writing, and even structured therapy help create this separation. Reading works that normalize inner conflict, Jung's essays or trauma-informed psychology, reinforces that nothing inside needs to be exiled. Integration also requires patience. The psyche doesn't reorganize overnight. Old emotional habits surface when stress hits. That's not failure, it's feedback. Jung believed wholeness includes contradictions. Strength and vulnerability coexist. Confidence and fear share space. When someone allows complexity instead of forcing perfection, healing accelerates naturally. Once the past is carried consciously instead of fought against, a new kind of stability emerges. The nervous system relaxes, choices feel clearer. And in that clarity, another insight appears. Trauma didn't just demand healing. It planted the conditions for meaning to be discovered afterward. Pain becomes unbearable when it feels random. Trauma hurts not only because of what happened, but because it seems pointless. Carl Jung understood that the psyche can endure almost anything once meaning begins to form. Meaning doesn't erase suffering, it reframes it. When pain is placed inside a larger narrative, it stops feeling like a dead end and starts resembling a passage. Think of trauma like a storm that knocks down familiar landmarks. At first, everything feels disoriented. But once the storm passes, new paths appear, paths that never existed before. Many people discover purpose only after something breaks. Compassion deepens, values sharpen, priorities rearrange. Meaning isn't found inside the wound itself, but in what the wound forces the soul to confront. In daily life, meaning shows up quietly. It's the urge to help others who are struggling, the desire to speak truth instead of staying silent, the pull toward work that feels aligned rather than impressive. Practical reflection helps here. Writing about what changed after pain, identifying new values, noticing where empathy has grown. Books like Man's Search for Meaning echo this truth. Suffering becomes lighter when it serves something larger. Jung believed that meaning emerges through individuation, the process of becoming who one truly is. Trauma accelerates this process by stripping away false identities. When the ego's masks fall, authenticity has room to breathe. That's why people shaped by trauma often feel called toward depth, honesty, and purpose. Pain clears the noise so meaning can speak. Once meaning begins to take shape, trauma loses its authority over identity. It becomes part of the journey rather than the destination, and at that point, a final realization starts to surface. Not everyone is refined by fire, and those who are carry a different responsibility moving forward. Not everyone is shaped by fire, and that's not an accident. Some lives move gently, others are pressed, tested, and reshaped early. Trauma doesn't choose randomly. It arrives where transformation is possible. Carl Jung believed that suffering often initiates those meant to carry deeper awareness. Being refined doesn't make someone superior, but it does make them responsible. Responsibility to live consciously, not automatically. Think of refinement like being given sharper tools. A sharper blade can build or destroy. Intention matters. Trauma refines perception, empathy, and discernment. But without awareness, those same qualities can turn inward as self-criticism or outward as isolation. The work is learning how to use what was forged. When pain is honored as preparation rather than punishment, purpose begins to feel closer. In real life, this responsibility shows up in choices, choosing truth over comfort, choosing boundaries over people-pleasing, choosing meaning over distraction. Practical actions matter. Protecting mental space, reading authors who value depth, surrounding oneself with conversations that nourish rather than drain. Even small rituals, like daily reflection or intentional silence, help channel refinement into clarity. Jung believed that those who descend into themselves return changed, not to escape the world, but to engage it more honestly. Trauma-refined individuals often become quiet stabilizers in chaotic spaces. They listen better. They speak with weight. They don't rush meaning. This isn't accidental, as it's the natural result of having faced what others avoid. When someone recognizes that trauma refined rather than ruined them, a shift occurs. Gratitude replaces resentment. Direction replaces confusion, and with that awareness, the mind becomes ready for something crucial, seeing how all these pieces connect and why understanding them now can change the future entirely. If trauma refined you, then the real question isn't what happened, it's what you're going to do with what it gave you. Awareness, depth, sensitivity, resilience. None of these are accidents. They were forged under pressure, shaped by experiences that demanded more from you than from most people. So now pause for a moment and reflect honestly. Where have you been using your pain as an excuse instead of a resource? Which part of your life is asking for courage, boundaries, or truth right now? And what would change if you stopped seeing your past as a burden and started seeing it as preparation? Knowledge alone doesn't transform lives. Application does. Start small. Pay attention to your emotional reactions this week. Notice the patterns instead of fighting. Choose one habit that brings clarity instead of distraction. One conversation where you speak honestly instead of safely. One moment where you act from awareness, not fear. And if this message resonated with you, it's because something inside you is ready to move forward. You're not here by chance. Subscribe to Mind's Silent Echo, turn on notifications and stay with us, because this channel exists to help you understand yourself more deeply, integrate what you've lived, and turn insight into real inner freedom. Now tell me in the comments, what part of this message hit you the hardest and why?